Hello, and welcome back to History Whispers. I'm your host, Emma Carter, and you've just tuned into another captivating episode of our ongoing series, The Greatest Philosophers of All Time. Over the past several episodes, we've taken a deep dive into the minds of ancient brilliance, from the enigmatic Heraclitus to the fearless Socrates, the visionary Plato, and the intellectual giant Aristotle. If you haven't caught up with those illuminating discussions, I highly recommend visiting our playlist and exploring in those timeless conversations. Today, we journey further into the cradle of Greek thought, turning our gaze toward a figure who was not only a philosopher, but a profound mathematician. Yes, I'm talking about none other than Pythagoras, a man whose name is often echoed in classrooms, but whose life and mind reach far beyond triangles and theorems. And as always, I'm thrilled to be joined by our beloved guest, Dr. Rhys Morgana, a distinguished classicist and philosopher whose insights continue to enrich the series episode after episode. Dr. Rhys, thank you so much once again for being here. I speak for myself and our entire audience when I say we're genuinely excited to learn from your deep analysis today on Pythagoras, his philosophy, and his legacy.
Thank you so much, Emma. It's always an honor to join you on this podcast. Every time we delve into these great minds of the past, I feel a profound connection to history itself. I'm truly grateful for the opportunity to share this journey with you and our listeners once again.
We always do, at the very roots. Today, we're talking about a name familiar to every student of mathematics, but often a mystery when it comes to his deeper life and legacy. So, could you help us unravel that mystery? Who was Pythagoras? When and where did he live? And what was the intellectual atmosphere like during his time? Were there any notable contemporaries, perhaps Socrates or other philosophers, whose lives or ideas intersected with his in some way?
That's an excellent place to begin, Emma. Thank you for setting the stage so thoughtfully. Pythagoras is one of those figures who stands at the intersection of legend and history, which makes him both fascinating and elusive. He was born around 570 BCE on the island of Samos, a Greek settlement in the Aegean Sea, during a period of extraordinary intellectual awakening known as the Archaic Age of Greece. This was a time when Greek thought was transitioning from mythological explanations of the world to rational, philosophical inquiry. Now, it's important to understand that Pythagoras predates Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, those towering figures of classical philosophy. In fact, Socrates wasn't born until about 100 years after Pythagoras. So no, their lives did not overlap. But Pythagoras laid foundational stones upon which thinkers like Plato would later build. Pythagoras lived during a time when pre-Socratic philosophers were active, thinkers such as Thales of Miletus, Anaximander, and Heraclitus. These philosophers, like Pythagoras, were preoccupied with understanding the nature of reality, the cosmos, and the principles that govern existence. But what sets Pythagoras apart is that he approached these questions not only through observation and contemplation, but also through mathematics and mysticism. He eventually left Samos, likely due to political unrest or dissatisfaction with the ruling tyranny, and traveled extensively, some sources say, to Egypt and Babylon, before settling in Croton, a Greek colony in southern Italy. There, he founded what can best be described as a school, a sect, and a way of life all rolled into one, the Pythagorean Brotherhood. This group wasn't merely about academic learning. It had rituals, a strict ethical code, and a deep belief in the mystical structure of the universe where numbers were sacred, and mathematical harmony reflected cosmic harmony. This philosophical and somewhat religious movement had an enormous influence on future Greek thought, particularly Plato, who is heavily inspired by Pythagorean ideas. So while he didn't have direct contemporaries like Socrates or Plato, his intellectual context was rich with early Greek speculation, and he was very much part of the evolution from myth to reason, shaping how philosophy, mathematics, and even science would unfold in the centuries to come.
Wow, Dr. Rhys. I have to admit, I never realized there were philosophers who came even before Socrates. I always thought Heraclitus might have been one of the earliest, but clearly there's a whole layer of thinkers predating him. That's genuinely fascinating, and honestly a bit mind-blowing. So now that we've gotten a sense of who Pythagoras was and the world he lived in, let's take a deeper dive. Dr. Rhys, let's talk about his philosophy. What were the core philosophical ideas that defined Pythagoras? How did he articulate his views about the world, the soul, and the cosmos? And would you say he made any groundbreaking innovations in philosophy that set him apart from others of his era?
Absolutely, Emma, and I'm so glad you brought that curiosity and enthusiasm into the conversation because Pythagoras is one of those figures whose ideas are often brushed aside as purely mathematical, when in reality, his philosophy was deeply rich, mystical, and transformative. Pythagoras' core philosophical notion was the belief that numbers are the essence of all things. To him, numbers weren't just tools for calculation, they were ontological realities, the very building blocks of the universe. He famously said, "All is number." This wasn't metaphorical. He genuinely believed that everything, the stars, music, the human soul, could be understood and harmonized through numerical relationships. One of his most famous contributions is, of course, the Pythagorean theorem. But even that, to Pythagoras, wasn't just a mathematical discovery. It was a reflection of the deep divine order of the cosmos. He saw mathematical harmony as a window into the soul of the universe. In fact, his studies in music revealed that musical harmony could be explained mathematically by ratios of string lengths, and this led him to propose the idea of the harmony of the spheres, the belief that planets and stars move according to mathematical equations, producing a symphony of cosmic music we cannot hear, but which shapes our reality. Philosophically, Pythagoras was also among the first in the Western tradition to articulate a belief in the immortality and transmigration of the soul, what we might today call reincarnation. He believed that the soul was eternal and passed through cycles of rebirth, and that through purification, self-discipline, and the pursuit of knowledge, one could transcend the cycle and return to a more divine state. This leads us to another profound aspect of his thinking, the idea of a moral and ascetic life. Pythagoras and his followers lived under strict ethical codes, including vegetarianism, silence, and daily rituals, because they believed that the soul could only ascend to truth through purity. In this sense, his philosophy wasn't separated from his way of life, it was a lived philosophy, grounded in practice. What's groundbreaking here is how Pythagoras merged metaphysics, ethics, mathematics, and mysticism into one holistic vision. He didn't just think about numbers, he saw them as the bridge between the physical and the divine. He was one of the first philosophers to posit a structured, knowable cosmos governed by intelligible principles, a legacy that would later inspire Plato's theory of forms and even echo into modern physics. So yes, Pythagoras' innovations were immense. He may not have left behind written works, his teachings were oral and passed down through his followers, but his intellectual fingerprint is all over the Western philosophical tradition.
So, moral virtue and cosmic order were both mathematical and spiritual for him. That's quite profound, isn't it? It's fascinating to think of a worldview where equations and ethics, numbers and the soul are all intertwined so deeply.
Exactly, Emma. For Pythagoras, numbers weren't just abstract tools, they were sacred. He believed that the same harmony found in music and mathematics also governed the soul and the universe. So living a virtuous life wasn't just about morality, it was about aligning oneself with the deeper mathematical and spiritual order of the cosmos. Truly profound indeed.
Dr. Rhys, as you've so insightfully discussed, the mysticism, the philosophy of lifelong learning, the emphasis on moral harmony within the soul, even the belief in reincarnation and abstaining from eating meat. These elements in Pythagorean thought seem remarkably aligned with the principles found in Hinduism. The parallels are hard to ignore. So my question is there any kind of historical or philosophical connection between Pythagorean teachings and Hinduism? Do we have any evidence or theories that suggest Pythagoras may have been influenced by Eastern traditions? Could you shed some light on this fascinating comparison?
That's a wonderful observation, Emma, and a very thoughtful question. Indeed, there are intriguing similarities between Pythagorean philosophy and the spiritual principles found in Hinduism, especially in concepts like reincarnation, the transmigration of the soul, ascetic living, and the practice of nonviolence through vegetarianism. These parallels have been noted for centuries and continue to generate a great deal of scholarly interest. Historically, it's believed that Pythagoras traveled extensively in his early years, including time spent in Egypt and possibly the Near East. There are also some claims, though not fully verified, that he may have ventured as far as India or at least encountered Indian philosophical traditions indirectly through Persian or Babylonian intermediaries. Ancient trade and knowledge routes, particularly those of the Silk Road and maritime connections, facilitated more intellectual cross-pollination than we might initially assume. The concept of metempsychosis, or the transmigration of the soul, a cornerstone of Pythagorean thought, is deeply rooted in Hindu philosophy as well. The idea that the soul is eternal and passes through many lifetimes aligns quite closely with the Hindu doctrine of samsara. Moreover, the emphasis Pythagoras placed on purification, ascetic living, and harmony mirrors the spiritual disciplines of Eastern traditions, particularly the yogic and Vedic practices. Now, we can't say with absolute certainty that Pythagoras was directly influenced by Hinduism, but the philosophical alignment is striking enough that many scholars posit at least an indirect connection. It's also possible that these shared themes arose independently, as part of a broader human quest for understanding the soul and the cosmos. In essence, what we see in Pythagoras is a kind of proto-global philosophy, a synthesis of the mathematical, the mystical, and the moral. And whether those ideas sprang from personal encounters with the East or through the exchange of ideas across cultures, they undeniably point to a timeless, borderless human effort to seek truth and harmony.
So, Dr. Rhys, based on everything you've shared about reincarnation, ascetic living, and the moral emphasis in Pythagoras' philosophy, it does make me wonder, is there a possibility that Pythagoras may have been influenced not just by Hindu ideas, but perhaps even by early forms of Buddhist philosophy, given the similarities in ethical discipline and the cycle of rebirth? What do you think about that?
That's a great question, Emma. While the similarities between Pythagorean thought and Buddhism are striking, especially ideas like reincarnation and ethical discipline, it's unlikely that Pythagoras was directly influenced by Buddhism itself. Historically, they were more or less contemporaries, rather than one preceding the other. However, it's possible that some early Indian philosophies, like the Upanishads or Jain ideas about the soul, reached the Mediterranean through trade and cultural exchange. So rather than a direct link to the Buddha, it's more accurate to say these were parallel explorations of life, ethics, and the nature of existence that arose in different cultures around the same time.
Dr. Rhys, I have to say, this has been such an eye-opening conversation. And while I'm sure we'll have future episodes devoted entirely to Hindu and Buddhist philosophers, because there's clearly so much to explore there, today, stay focused on Pythagoras. Since we're already exploring these fascinating connections between his philosophy and spiritual traditions, I'd love to circle back to something you mentioned earlier, his extraordinary view of numbers. We often think of math as purely practical, but for Pythagoras, it seems to have been almost sacred. Could you explain what he meant by the philosophy of mathematics? How did he come to see numbers not just as tools for measurement, but as the very essence of reality itself?
Absolutely, Emma. And I think it's wonderful that you've highlighted how, for Pythagoras, mathematics wasn't simply an intellectual exercise. It was something profoundly spiritual, almost mystical. To Pythagoras, numbers were not just human inventions for counting sheep or measuring land. They were the eternal principles underlying all existence. In other words, numbers were the substance and the structure of reality itself. One of the key insights that shaped this worldview came from his study of music. As the story goes, he was fascinated by how plucking strings of different lengths produced sounds that felt naturally harmonious. When he measured the lengths, he discovered that simple ratios like 2:1 or 3:2 always produced pleasing intervals. This convinced him that mathematical relationships weren't arbitrary. They were universal truths that govern not only music, but everything. Building on that, he developed the idea of the harmony of the spheres, the belief that the planets and stars themselves moved according to similar mathematical proportions and produced a kind of divine, inaudible music. While we now know that model isn't literally correct, it was revolutionary at the time. No one had ever proposed that the cosmos might be ruled by numerical laws rather than the whims of the gods. Even more fascinating is that Pythagoras and his followers believed studying numbers could purify the soul. Mathematics became a kind of spiritual discipline, a way to glimpse the eternal order beneath the surface of a chaotic world. You could almost think of it as a form of meditation. Contemplating numbers was a path to understanding the divine structure of reality. So when we say he saw numbers as the essence of reality, we mean he truly believed everything, from the orbits of the planets to the moral character of human beings, could be understood through proportion, ratio, and harmony. In that sense, mathematics wasn't just practical for him. It was the most sacred language of all.
Dr. Rhys, moving beyond his mathematical contributions, I've also come across references to something rather intriguing, that Pythagoras founded what some describe as a secret society, or a kind of brotherhood. Could you explain what exactly the Pythagorean Brotherhood was? How did it function, and what made it so unique, even radical, compared to other philosophical groups in the Greek world at that time?
That's a fantastic question, Emma, because the Pythagorean Brotherhood is one of the most fascinating and sometimes misunderstood aspects of Pythagoras' legacy. To start, it's important to realize that this wasn't just a school or a gathering of students in the modern sense. The Pythagorean Brotherhood was part philosophical academy, part religious sect, and part ethical community, a way of life that blended science, spirituality, and social experiment. The Brotherhood was established in Crotone, a Greek colony in southern Italy, after Pythagoras left Samos. It attracted many followers, including men and women, which in itself was quite radical for the time. Members were bound by strict rules of conduct, both intellectual and moral. In many ways, it functioned more like a monastic order than a typical school. Here are some defining characteristics that made it unique. 1. Shared property and communal living. Members were expected to renounce private possessions. All wealth and resources were pooled together to create an egalitarian community. This was extremely unusual in a Greek society built on household wealth and individual status. 2. Secrecy and initiation. The Brotherhood operated under a veil of secrecy. New initiates underwent rigorous testing and had to observe long periods of silence, sometimes up to 5 years, to train their self-discipline and humility. Only those who passed these tests were admitted to the innermost teachings. 3. Dietary and ethical codes. Pythagoreans practiced vegetarianism, abstained from beans which they believed had special properties related to the soul, and adhered to detailed purity rituals. They also held strong beliefs about reincarnation, so any act of violence or indulgence was seen as spiritually corrupting. 4. Philosophical and scientific study. While the Brotherhood had religious elements, it was also a serious center for learning. Members studied mathematics, astronomy, music theory, and geometry, believing that these disciplines revealed the cosmic order and purified the mind. It's also important to mention that Pythagorean influence actually extended to political affairs. Because the Brotherhood was so cohesive and disciplined, it became a powerful force in the civic life of Crotone and other cities. In fact, this political influence eventually provoked suspicion and hostility. According to some sources, opposition from rival factions led to the burning of their meeting place and the scattering or even persecution of members. But we can come back to that later. 6. Symbolism and sacred numbers. The Brotherhood also used symbols, secret signs, and numerical mysticism to express their teachings. For example, the Tetractys, a triangular arrangement of 10 dots, was considered a symbol of universal harmony and perfection. In short, the Pythagorean Brotherhood wasn't just an intellectual circle. It was an experiment in living philosophy.
They tried to embody their ideas in every aspect of daily life. That combination of communal ideals, spiritual discipline, and scientific inquiry made them both admired and feared. And it set a precedent for later philosophical schools that sought to fuse knowledge and ethical practice. It's no exaggeration to say that they were one of the first examples of a community that tried to build an entire way of life around the pursuit of truth.
That really is quite fascinating, Dr. Rhys. So just as Plato had his academy and his student Aristotle established the Lyceum, it sounds like Pythagoras created something very similar in spirit, a place where he not only taught, but also built a whole way of life around his philosophy and the brotherhood you described. This makes me wonder, how exactly is this early academy or gathering place described in historical sources? Who are the historians or ancient writers that give us details about it? And are there any ruins or archaeological remains in Croton, like we have for Plato's Academy and Aristotle's Lyceum in Greece, that help us understand what it looked like?
That's an excellent set of questions, Emma, because it gets at the heart of one of the great challenges of studying Pythagoras, which is separating legend from verifiable history. Let's start with how this gathering place is described. Most of what we know about Pythagoras' academy comes from later biographers and philosophers, because he himself left no written records. Among the most important sources are Porphyry, a Neoplatonist philosopher writing in the 3rd century CE, who composed Life of Pythagoras; Iamblichus, another Neoplatonist writing in the 4th century CE, who authored On the Pythagorean Life; earlier mentions by Herodotus, Diogenes Laertius, and later summaries in the writings of Aristotle and his followers. These accounts consistently describe the place in Croton as a kind of philosophical commune or house of meeting. It is often referred to as a sacred house rather than simply a school, reflecting its dual role as both an intellectual center and a spiritual community. Why is it described that way? The reason is that the Brotherhood's way of life blended philosophy, religious ritual, and ethical training in a way that was unprecedented. While Plato and Aristotle certainly emphasized community among students, Pythagoras' followers actually lived together, shared all property, and adhered to initiatory practices. To many outsiders, this looked like a secretive sect rather than a school. That perception probably fed both its mystique and the later suspicion that led to its downfall. Who described it? As I mentioned, most detailed descriptions come from Neoplatonist philosophers who admired Pythagoras as a kind of sage. They were writing several centuries after his death and often blended genuine tradition with idealized storytelling. Even Aristotle references Pythagorean teachings, although often critically, especially in discussions of mathematics and metaphysics. Are there any ruins today? This is where things get tricky. Unlike Plato's Academy or Aristotle's Lyceum, there are no confirmed ruins of Pythagoras' house or meeting place in Croton. Part of the reason is historical. The Brotherhood eventually became so influential in civic affairs that rival factions turned against them. There are accounts of their meeting place being attacked and burned, forcing the community to disperse or go underground. Additionally, Croton itself went through centuries of conflict, conquest, and rebuilding, and archaeological excavations have been limited. While scholars have located parts of ancient Croton's city layout, including temples and public spaces, there is no surviving building that can be definitively identified as the Pythagorean meeting house. So in summary, we have vivid descriptions of the Brotherhood's communal living from later writers. We know it functioned as a school, sanctuary, and philosophical laboratory all in one, but we do not have physical remains like those associated with Plato's Academy or Aristotle's Lyceum. In a way, this lack of ruins only adds to the air of mystery around Pythagoras. His legacy feels almost like an echo, something that reshaped philosophy and mathematics profoundly, yet left only stories and ideas in its wake.
Dr. Rhys, there's actually one question about mathematics that I meant to ask earlier when we were discussing that part of Pythagoras' legacy. Before preparing for this episode, I spent some time reading about his ideas, and I came across something that really caught my attention. I read that Pythagoras and his followers believed certain numbers had almost magical or sacred qualities. For instance, that the number 10 was considered the most perfect number. Could you share more about this fascinating number symbolism and explain what it meant to them, both philosophically and spiritually?
I'm so glad you brought this up, Emma, because this is one of the most distinctive and intriguing aspects of Pythagorean thought. To the Pythagoreans, numbers weren't just quantities you could count on your fingers, they were principles of existence, the secret architecture behind everything from music to ethics to the structure of the cosmos. Each number had a specific, almost mystical significance. Let's start with your example, the number 10. This was called the Tetractys, which comes from the Greek for four-parted. The Tetractys was a triangular figure made by arranging 10 points in 4 rows. 1 point on top, 2 in the second row, 3 in the third, 4 on the bottom. This figure wasn't just a clever visual pattern. It was regarded as the symbol of universal harmony. The number 10 itself was thought to be the most complete and perfect number because it was the sum of the first 4 integers. 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 equals 10. Each row of the Tetractys corresponded to a dimension of existence. The one, the monad, unity and the origin of all things. The two, the dyad, diversity, division, the first departure from the one. The three, the triad, harmony since it reconciles the opposition of the dyad. The four, the tetrad, solidity and justice, the first square number. 5, marriage, because it combined the first male number, 3, and the first female number, 2. 7, the number of life and spiritual development, since it was associated with the lunar cycles. This numeric symbolism extended to their cosmology and ethics. For example, Pythagoreans believed the planets were arranged in a harmonious sequence governed by these numbers, producing the music of the spheres. They also thought a person could achieve moral balance by aligning their soul with these numerical relationships. In many ways, you could say their philosophy was an early form of numerology, but with a rigor that bordered on proto-science. It showed a conviction that truth and beauty are inseparable, and that mathematics wasn't just a human invention. It was a revelation of the divine structure of reality itself. So when you hear that the number 10 was sacred, it wasn't a superstition in the way we often imagine. It was the culmination of an entire worldview in which numbers held the key to understanding everything, from ethics to cosmology to the purpose of life.
Honestly, Dr. Rhys, it's such a wonderful blend. Mathematics and philosophy coming together to create what almost feels like magic in the hands of Pythagoras. I have to say, the more you explain, the more I'm convinced that if we wanted to do justice to the mathematical side of his legacy alone, we'd probably need at least 2 or 3 more episodes to cover it all properly. But for now, I'd love to switch gears just a little bit. In some of the reading I did while preparing for today, I came across so many legends and myths about Pythagoras. Stories that he could communicate with animals or even possessed supernatural powers. How much of this do historians actually consider credible? And why do you think such extraordinary myths grew up around his legacy in the first place?
Definitely, Emma. You're absolutely right. Mathematics was truly the core of Pythagoras' identity, and you could almost say that his philosophy was the side portion that grew out of his devotion to numbers. Even that side portion, as you can see, is enormously rich and detailed. But when you look at his mathematical contributions in depth, you realize they are even more vast, nuanced, and influential. Anyway, let's come to your question about the myths and legends, which are, frankly, some of the most colorful parts of his legacy. Pythagoras is probably one of the most mythologized figures in all of Western philosophy. From quite early on, he was surrounded by a kind of aura, a reputation that mixed fact, reverence, and legend. Here are a few of the extraordinary stories people told about him. He could remember all his past lives, including as a warrior and a fisherman.
He had a golden thigh, which he allegedly revealed to prove his divine nature. He could tame animals simply by speaking or playing music, for example, stopping an ox from eating beans by whispering in his ear. He could bilocate, meaning he was seen in two places at once. So, why did all these myths grow up around him? There are a few reasons. First, Pythagoras himself taught in a semi-secretive way. His brotherhood was organized around initiation, vows of silence, and a hierarchy of inner and outer teachings. Whenever you create mystery and exclusivity, you inevitably invite speculation and legend. Second, his followers treated him with near religious devotion. They referred to him simply as the Master, and some even believed he was a demigod or a figure sent from Apollo. That sort of veneration fueled the idea that he had supernatural qualities. Third, we have to remember that in the ancient world, the line between philosophy, religion, and folklore was much thinner than it is today. Philosophers often borrowed language and imagery from religious traditions, and the public didn't always separate intellectual contributions from mythic ones. From a historical standpoint, very little of the supernatural material is considered credible by modern scholars. Most of it is viewed as hagiography, stories created by admirers to convey symbolic truths about his character rather than literal events. But these legends are still important because they show us how deeply he influenced the imagination of later generations. In a sense, the fact that people felt compelled to wrap Pythagoras in myth says something profound about how they perceived him, not only as a mathematician or philosopher, but as a kind of bridge between the human and the divine.
Okay, well, that's absolutely fascinating, Dr. Rhys. It's incredible how a single figure could inspire so much awe and so many stories. Now, bringing our conversation into the present, I'd like to ask you this. When we look at the whole philosophy of Pythagoras, his ideas about mathematics, music, ethics, and virtue, everything you've so thoroughly explained, how can we relate these teachings to our modern world? Where do you see his influence or relevance in the way we live and think today?
That's such a thoughtful question, Emma. And it goes right to the heart of why we still bother to study ancient philosophy today. Pythagoras might have lived over 2,500 years ago, but his ideas continue to resonate in ways many people don't even realize. Let's look at a few areas where his philosophy is strikingly relevant in modern life. 1. Mathematics as the language of nature. Today, when scientists talk about the elegance of mathematical laws, whether in physics, chemistry, or biology, they are echoing a Pythagorean conviction that numbers are more than symbols. For example, consider how we use equations to model the spread of diseases, or how physicists describe the structure of space-time. The idea that reality has a hidden mathematical order was radical in Pythagoras' day, and now it is one of the pillars of modern science. 2. The harmony of music and emotion. Pythagoras' insight that music and math are linked has shaped everything from classical music theory to modern acoustics, but it also points to something deeper, the idea that harmony and sound can bring harmony in the soul. Today, music therapy draws on this same intuition. Many people use music intentionally to regulate their mood, focus their minds, or cultivate a sense of peace. That's a Pythagorean principle in action. 3. Ethical self-discipline. Pythagoras believed that living a virtuous life required discipline, reflection, and self-restraint. While our culture today often emphasizes instant gratification, there's also a growing countercurrent, minimalism, mindfulness, and slow living, that tries to recover a sense of purpose and inner order. The idea that ethics is a daily practice, not just an abstract idea, is very much a Pythagorean inheritance. 4. Holistic education and lifelong learning. He taught that mathematics, music, philosophy, and ethics were all facets of one quest: understanding and perfecting yourself. In today's world of specialization and compartmentalized knowledge, there's a renewed interest in holistic education, cultivating the whole person, not just technical skill. Many universities and educational reformers are trying to create models that develop intellectual, emotional, and ethical capacities together. 5. The spiritual dimension of knowledge. Finally, Pythagoras reminds us that knowledge can be a spiritual endeavor. Whether you're religious or not, there is something profoundly human in the search for an underlying order and purpose. For Pythagoras, studying mathematics wasn't just about calculation, it was about aligning oneself with a cosmic truth. Even now, that hunger for meaning is part of why so many people are drawn to philosophy, science, and art. So if you look closely, you'll see that Pythagoras' legacy is still alive in the classroom, in the laboratory, in music studios, and self-help books, and in the quiet moments when people ask themselves, how do I create harmony within my life? In a time when the world often feels fragmented and hurried, the Pythagorean ideal that life should be an ordered, ethical, and beautiful whole has never been more relevant.
All right, Dr. Rhys. As we come to the final part of our conversation, and this has truly been such an enlightening discussion, I'd love to ask you the question I always look forward to. What is your favorite quotation attributed to Pythagoras? Could you share why this particular saying speaks to you personally and what you believe it explains or teaches us about humanity as a whole?
That's a beautiful way to conclude, Emma. Thank you for asking this question because it always helps us connect these ancient thinkers to something deeply human. One of my favorite quotations attributed to Pythagoras is this: "Do not say a little in many words, but a great deal in a few." On the surface, it seems like a simple piece of advice about how to communicate. But to me, it goes much deeper. It captures something essential about clarity, discipline, and respect for truth. Here's why it resonates with me. In our age of information overload, 24-hour news, social media, endless commentary, it's easy to get caught up in noise. Pythagoras reminds us that wisdom isn't measured by the number of words or how loudly we speak. It's measured by the depth and integrity of what we say. This principle also reflects how he lived. Pythagoras was famous for valuing silence and contemplation. His followers observed long periods of quiet reflection before they were even allowed to ask questions. He believed that only by disciplining your mind and your speech could you align yourself with the harmony of the cosmos. Philosophically, this quotation also touches on the idea that truth is often simple but profound. Just like a mathematical equation can express a vast reality in a few symbols, a well-chosen sentence can reveal more than a whole book of rambling words. For humanity, I think this teaches us an enduring lesson: to live and to speak with purpose. Whether we're making decisions, offering advice, or simply sharing a thought, the quality of our words matters far more than the quantity. So every time I come across this quote, it reminds me to slow down, be intentional, and strive to express only what is necessary and true. And that, I think, is as relevant now as it was in Pythagoras' time.
And with that, it's time for us to wrap up this episode. This was episode number 5 of our series, The Greatest Philosophers of All Time. Dr. Rhys, I can't thank you enough for the clarity, depth, and passion you bring to these conversations. You have an incredible gift for turning history into something vivid and alive. Thank you so much for being here with us today and guiding us through the remarkable world of Pythagoras, not just as a mathematician, but as a thinker whose ideas still echo in our lives. I truly hope you'll keep joining us for the rest of the adventure.
It's absolutely my pleasure, Emma. Every time I sit down with you, it feels like we're opening a door back into the past.
Sharing these ideas is always a joy, and I really do believe that the greatest gift we can offer one another is the gift of knowledge.
That's such a beautiful thought, Dr. Rhys. And I couldn't agree more. And to all our listeners, thank you so much for tuning in and being part of this journey. If you enjoyed today's episode, please take a moment to subscribe, share, and give us a like. We'd love to hear from you, so don't forget to drop a comment below. Which philosophers should we explore next? What did you find most inspiring about Pythagoras? Your feedback means the world to us. Until next time, take care, stay curious, and remember, history is always whispering.